Why is it that the West and their media always seem to have something to say about Africa? It's like they can't help but stick their noses into situations that don't concern them. You'd think with all their challenges back home, rising costs of living, healthcare issues, and political divisions, they'd focus on fixing their own problems. But no, meddling in African affairs seems to be their favourite pastime. Take what's happening in Mali, for example. Recently, the country made headlines when videos and photos of a massive military convoy started making rounds online. The images showed a jaw-dropping display of military strength, over 100 vehicles including trucks, tanks and other heavy equipment rolling through Mali. Instead of waiting for facts, Western media rushed to flood the internet with wild guesses and dramatic headlines. It's like they couldn't resist spinning their own stories about the Malian government and its military leader, Colonel Assimi Goïta. Let's break this down. On January 17, 2025, Malian state TV showed footage of a convoy entering the country. This wasn't just any convoy, it was packed with serious firepower. There were T-72B3M tanks, BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, BTR-82A armoured personnel carriers, and various other high-tech military gear like Spartak and Tiger 4x4 vehicles. Even artillery, anti-aircraft cannons and boats were part of the lineup. It was clear Mali was making significant moves to beef up its defence capabilities. Just 2 days later, on January 19th, Colonel Goïta addressed the nation. He announced plans to build a self-reliant defence industry, focusing on producing weapons, assembling tactical vehicles, and manufacturing ammunition and explosives. But interestingly, he didn't say a word about the convoy. Maybe he had his reasons, or maybe it wasn't the main focus of his message. But of course, the West wasn't having it. Rather than taking a step back, they started buzzing with questions. Where did this equipment come from? How could Mali afford it? The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense was quick to jump in, claiming the equipment might have been transported by Russian railways because of some markings on the vehicles. Here's something that might surprise you. Ever since Mali became a focal point in global headlines, the stories surrounding its military equipment have been nothing short of wild. There's no shortage of opinions and speculation, and the latest buzz points fingers at, you guessed it, Russia and its notorious Wagner group. Let's rewind a bit. Back in 2022, the French military wrapped up nearly a decade of operations in Mali. They were there under missions like Serval and Barkhane, fighting off extremist groups, including ISIS affiliates, that were trying to destabilize the region. But after the French left, a new player entered the scene. Wagner PMC, a private military company linked to Russia. This group became a significant presence, supposedly working hand-in-hand with the Malian government, which leans pro-Russia. According to various reports, friction is brewing between the locals, backed by Western allies, and these Russian forces alongside the Malian government. Adding to the intrigue is the question of where Mali's newly acquired military equipment will end up. Some say it's bound for Wagner and the government forces, meant to strengthen their fight against terrorist groups and other militant factions in the region. But that's not all. There's another theory floating around that the equipment might have a Syrian connection. This one takes us back to late 2024, when Syria faced a major turning point. A coalition of Syrian rebels launched a series of attacks, eventually pushing into Damascus. By December, Bashar al-Assad fled to Moscow, seeking political asylum. Following his departure, Russia began pulling out its military assets from Syria, with some redirected to other conflict zones like Libya. Some analysts now claim that a portion of this hardware might have been shipped to Mali during this chaotic withdrawal. Their reasoning? They believe it's meant for Russian-backed paramilitary groups, rather than Mali's national forces. If you are still watching this video, it means you love it, and you love the direction Africa is heading towards as a continent. Why not take out a second and show us support by hitting that like button? Have you done that? Let us move on. Analysts have latched onto the idea that something big is brewing in Mali, and they're not keeping quiet about it. Their theories gained traction after reports surfaced about major construction work at Bamako's Base 101. Back in October 2024, satellite images analysed by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, revealed the construction of several large buildings. These weren't your average structures. They appeared capable of housing hundreds of troops and storing a significant amount of military gear. Naturally, this led to whispers that Russia might be setting up a military base in Mali. And predictably, the West isn't thrilled about the idea. After all, Russia is often painted as the bad guy in their narrative. But here's the question. Even if these rumors are true, why does it matter so much to them? When countries like the US and France built military bases across Africa, they did so with agreements from the local governments. Mali, like any other nation, is sovereign. It has the right to decide who it partners with. And if Colonel Assimi Goïta believes Russia can address the security challenges France failed to solve, isn't that his call to make? Western nations don't take kindly to outsiders dissecting their decisions, so why do they feel the need to scrutinize and interfere with African nations when they act independently? Even leaders like Rwanda's President Paul Kagame have pointed out the pitfalls of blindly following Western directives. Kagame has warned that these so-called solutions often create more problems than they solve, leaving African nations in deeper trouble. Let's look at Mali's experience with France. Back in 2013, the two partnered under Operation Barkhane, aimed at combating terrorism in the region. For a decade, France operated across the Sahel with advanced intelligence and military technology. Yet despite all this, insecurity persisted, and Mali's military saw no significant improvement. After years of fruitless collaboration, Mali decided it was time to try something different. As the saying goes, doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. Niger's experience with the US paints a similar picture. The US established one of its most expensive military bases in Niger under the banner of counter-terrorism. But the details of their defense agreement were nothing short of lopsided. Niger shouldered taxes related to American military operations, yet had no transparency regarding the number of US personnel, the equipment deployed, or the intelligence gathered. To top it off, the US wasn't obligated to assist Niger against militant threats. If Niger called for help, the US could simply say no. What good was this partnership if it didn't actually address the security issues on the ground? Despite the US military's presence, terrorism in Niger not only persisted but worsened. Their surveillance seemed more about monitoring regional developments for Western interests than actually aiding Niger. This dynamic left one thing clear. The partnership wasn't about Niger's security, but rather the West's agenda to control the region and keep threats contained. And now, when countries like Mali and Niger pivot toward Russia, the West is quick to raise eyebrows and throw accusations. But the truth is, these nations are simply exploring alternatives after decades of unmet promises and ineffective partnerships. If their decisions make the West uncomfortable, maybe it's time for some self-reflection instead of pointing fingers. When Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso decided they'd had enough of Western military presence and showed France and the US the door, predictions of chaos came pouring in from Western analysts. They painted a grim picture. These countries would fall apart and insurgent groups would run wild. But reality? It's painting a very different story. Yes, there have been attacks. Insurgents are still a threat and lives have been lost, both military and civilian. But instead of crumbling, these nations have stood their ground. Not only are they fighting back, but they're also achieving victories that seemed impossible before. The secret? A major military overhaul. By partnering with countries like Russia, Turkey, and Iran, they've been able to upgrade their forces and get the equipment they needed, something they couldn't achieve under years of Western partnerships. How exactly does the West claim to be the better ally here? Let's turn to the eyebrow-raising comments from Ukraine's Ministry of Defense regarding Mali's newly acquired equipment. They stated, "Russia has deployed Wagner PMC units in Mali, which became more active after the French military left in 2022. On the surface, that might sound accurate, until you remember that France didn't just pack up and leave voluntarily. They were, to put it plainly, kicked out. Sure, French President Emmanuel Macron can deny it all he wants, claiming it was part of a grand strategy to reorganize their African policy, but no one's buying that story. Everyone knows France was shown the door. The statement also gives France credit for countering jihadist groups as part of Operation Serval and Barkhane between 2013 and 2022. But let's be real. If they were so successful, why was the situation worse when they left than when they arrived? The insecurity started in 2012, and France stepped in shortly after. Yet, instead of improving, terrorist groups spread across Mali, taking over nearly half the country. It wasn't until Mali severed ties with France and partnered with Russia that they began reclaiming their land and turning the tide. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense also claimed that the local population, supported by Western countries, is resisting Russian mercenaries and the pro-Russian government. This statement isn't just wrong, it's laughable. Mali's citizens are anything but pro-Western. They've cheered on their government's decisions to cut ties with France and build a partnership with Russia. In fact, the people of Mali and much of the Sahel have shown overwhelming support for their new alliances. Anti-Western sentiment is widespread, fueled by years of unmet promises and deteriorating security under Western influence. As for the claim that Russia is the master of propaganda, well, isn't that exactly what Ukraine and the West are doing here? It's almost as if some countries think Africans can't see through the smoke and mirrors. The West seems to assume that people on this continent aren't paying attention, that they're incapable of recognizing hypocrisy when they see it. But the truth is, Africans are sharp, observant, and fully aware of what's happening around them. They know who's standing with them and who's just pretending to help. Take Mali, for instance. A few months ago, the country faced a brutal assault when Tuareg rebels launched a coordinated attack on Malian forces and their Russian allies. Over 3 days, the conflict claimed the lives of 47 Malian soldiers and 84 members of Wagner PMC. While Mali was grappling with the aftermath of this tragedy, a bombshell dropped. Ukraine's military intelligence spokesperson, Andriy Yusov, went on national television and openly suggested that the rebels had access to key intelligence that enabled their strike. His exact words: "The rebels received the necessary information they needed to conduct a successful operation." If that wasn't shocking enough, the rebels themselves added fuel to the fire. After the attack, they released a public statement expressing solidarity with Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. They even offered to hand over captured Wagner fighters as a show of support. So, 2 glaring questions arise. How did Ukraine know the rebels had access to such precise intelligence? And why were the rebels aligning themselves with Ukraine in the first place? The dots practically connect themselves. It's hard to ignore the possibility that Ukraine had a hand in this, feeding the rebels the information they needed to strike. Of course, Ukrainian officials denied any involvement, but their denials didn't convince anyone in Mali or neighboring Niger. Both countries went so far as to sever diplomatic ties with Ukraine, accusing it of supporting terrorist groups. Despite all this, Ukraine now wants to act like a concerned observer, commenting on Mali's internal affairs. The hypocrisy isn't lost on anyone. Africans see through the charade. They know the difference between genuine allies and those who are only pretending to care. Any nation that truly helps Africa stands as a friend, while those that use the continent for their interests are nothing more than adversaries. While the West fumes over Russia's growing influence in Africa, countries like Burkina Faso are taking matters into their own hands. They've embraced Russia as a partner, and the relationship is steadily gaining momentum. On November 7, 2024, Burkina Faso's Defense Minister Kassoum Coulibaly met with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to discuss bolstering defense ties. Shoigu described the partnership as one rooted in mutual respect and shared interests. Coulibaly, in turn, called the talks a move toward practical, meaningful collaboration. This wasn't a one-off meeting. Back in August, Burkina Faso welcomed a high-level Russian delegation led by Deputy Defense Minister Yunus Bek Yevkurov to Ouagadougou. That visit followed earlier discussions between Burkina Faso's interim president, Ibrahim Traoré, and Vladimir Putin at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg. It's clear that these ties aren't just symbolic, they're strategic and deliberate, aimed at fostering genuine cooperation. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose to power in Burkina Faso after the September 2022 coup, he didn't just take the reins of leadership, he charted a new course for his country. Instead of continuing to lean on its former colonial power, France, Burkina Faso, turned its focus toward building new, diverse partnerships. One country in particular has emerged as a key ally, Russia. Traoré hasn't been shy about this shift, reportedly calling Russia a strategic ally. And it's not just talk, action has followed. In October, Burkina Faso signed a landmark agreement with Russia to construct a nuclear power plant. For a country where fewer than 1 in 4 people have access to electricity, this is more than just a deal. It's a game changer. Russia's state atomic energy agency, Rosatom, announced the partnership, emphasizing that it marked the beginning of cooperation in nuclear energy. The plan isn't just about power generation, it's also expected to extend into areas like agriculture, medicine, and industry, promising a ripple effect of benefits for the country. But that's not all. Russia has also pledged to provide free grain to Burkina Faso, a gesture that underscores the growing ties between the two nations. For a Sahel country grappling with food insecurity and other challenges, this promise of assistance is more than symbolic, it's deeply practical. Burkina Faso isn't the only African nation strengthening ties with Russia. Zimbabwe, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Cameroon are just a few others forging alliances with Moscow, even as the West imposes sanctions on Russia over its conflict with Ukraine. The big question is, why are countries like Burkina Faso turning to Russia, a rival of the West, instead of sticking with their traditional Western partners? Let us know what you think in the comments section below. See you in our next video.